Peter, here we are on the 36th anniversary, or just past it anyway, of the Black Friday crash. And while kids these days might think of it as just a great time to shop on Amazon, for many people in the investment world, it's a day that they'll never forget as the biggest single day market crash of all time, which was 23% in one day. And now Peter is warning investors again that something potentially far worse could be on the horizon. And he's definitely not alone in that sentiment. Now, Peter, before I turn it over to you and ask you some questions, I think some people are pretty clued in as to what's going on in the world right now. They see something bad is brewing in the wind right now. The government says that inflation is now under control. But I think anyone who's actually living in the real world, when they go to buy their groceries, they go to put gas in their car, and, God help them if they go to buy or rent a house, they realize that that's just a big farce. And perhaps even more so in an election year where they're really painting everything with rose-colored glasses. But before we get to all that, can you take us back to 1987 and really sort of dive into what raised red flags for you in calling what we now refer to as a Black Friday crash?
When I look back at it now, especially now as I come upon my 40th year, I really knew very little then compared to what I know now. I've always felt for the last couple of decades that it was inspired by a higher being, for my case, by my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But it certainly wasn't from a pure educational standpoint because I had such limited experience. And, to make such a dire forecast and then turn around when everybody now is recognizing the dire and really seeing things to be bad to somehow conclude that the worst is over and it was going to get better. And I still to this day, and I don't think I'll know until I stand before my maker and hopefully shows the videotape and explains what led me to that call. But nevertheless, as you noted, it did elevate my recognition to a national level. I got brought on to Good Morning America, where the head of the business editor gave me the moniker, the Wall Street Whiz Kid. And the reason it changed and why the book, while in its fifth edition now, is called Former Wall Street Whiz Kid, because since that time I managed to make and lose large sums of money not once but twice. And I don't think anybody should call himself a whiz kid if you can manage to do that twice. So it's the former whiz kid. I appreciate what you said at the start about being a legend, but the only legend for a period of time was in my own mind. But humbleness has pushed that legend aside, and I put my pant legs on one leg at a time like everybody else.
Mhm. Well, I don't think anyone makes it out of this game without losing big at some point, So I would still consider you to be the whiz kid for sure. Well, maybe not whiz kid anymore. I don't know if you're a grandfather, but maybe whiz grandfather. How's that sound?
Well, when you've been at it for 40 years, uh, and you see it now, and this is really, really important whether a person was seriously an investor or not. The market and the environment I worked in when I started and where we are now is totally different. There's very little remnants of anything that's left from that era. In fact, if you turn on one of those networks and you still see them sitting down at the stock exchange, that might as well be a museum because even most of the trading doesn't even happen there. So it's a totally, totally different environment and a game. And unfortunate, as you uh, hinted at, a couple of years ago, I made a decision that America had entered its worst ever social, political, and economic era. And I believe it's only getting worse. And I really wish I could be more optimistic. It would enhance business. It doesn't help business being, if I was selling something that went along with that, like dry food or ammo or cabins in the woods, it might help. But when you have such a really concerning outlook that I have, a lot of people don't want to hear it. In fact, Scott, what I hear often is, well, Mr. Grandich, I believe you're right, but I'm praying you're wrong. And I just hope it doesn't happen. And let me just say, if we say nothing else in this interview, hope is the single best spiritual strategy, but it's the absolute worst investment strategy. You need something more than hope. But a lot of people go on it basically on a hope basis.
I absolutely agree. So I wouldn't even know where to begin, to be honest with you. What makes you think that we're in such a dire predicament right now? And would you sort of label this sort of um, I guess the calm before the storm right now? I guess I feel personally like we're already in a storm, but I think that's sort of lost on the general public. But what? Maybe you could just, in a nutshell, tell us why we're in such a dire situation right now.
Sure. So it's important to note that I grounded myself halfway through my career from a secular foundation into a spiritual foundation. And we'll leave it at that unless you wish to speak more about it. But when you just look at the secular outlook, let's start with the single biggest concern I have is an inability soon to even potentially pay the interest on the debt that we owe as a nation. We just recently approaching $34 trillion in debt. And I always remind people that debt does not include what the government is still expected to pay in terms of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid payments. And people estimate that that's tens of trillions of dollars or more. But where the real problem comes now is we're running these multi-trillion dollar budget deficits. And Scott, I never imagined at any time in my career that we would be talking about trillion-dollar anything, let alone trillion-dollar yearly budget deficits. When I started, the total debt was less than $1 trillion, let alone that the budget deficit now is. And to give an example of how concerning that is, there's the last bastion of political bipartisanship is something called the Congressional Budget Office in Washington. And earlier this year, they put out a warning that at the rate America was growing in terms of its debt and deficits, in less than 10 years, we'd be at $50 trillion. And if you just stop there and think about that for a moment and say the interest on that is just 5%. Yeah, if you've only been around the last few years, 5% sounds high. But if you've been around more than a few years, 5% is not that high of an interest rate. And at 5% and $50 trillion, we would have a yearly interest expense of $2.5 trillion that has to be paid. People that have that debt want to be paid. The problem with that is last year was our single best year as a country where we took in a little bit over $5 trillion. So half of that would go to pay just the interest. We couldn't begin to operate as a country, or at least as we know it, to take care of all the other needs. When you throw on top of that, that 65% of Americans now are working paycheck to paycheck, they really have no room to add any more cost, including perhaps a higher interest expense to pay back. And that will come because the government will have to raise taxes in order to meet that obligation. And so, just from an economic standpoint, there's a huge concern that I can't imagine how we're going forward. In fact, that Congressional Budget Office now says because of the deficit spending, it could be as soon as 6 years that we reach that number. That's pretty well in everybody's lifespan that's going to watch this recording, and most people aren't prepared for it. And then you have to throw in the political and social aspects. Politically, not only do we have two ruling parties who can't stand to be in the room with each other, they now have a serious number of people within their own parties that disagree with the party. So this would be the group that's going to be expected to deal with these burgeoning problems, which only get worse. And then there's the social aspect. And the social aspect covers everything from we have millions of people coming into the country now, really with just the shirts on their back. And I'm not here to discuss whether that's good or they're bad or what have you, but it's going to add millions and millions of people who basically are going to be totally dependent on some sort of assistance and burdened on an already overburdened system. And then there's just the simple things of lifestyle compared to what we grew up with. You know, I use as a poster child, Scott, public storage and what's wrong with America. And everybody says, what the heck's wrong with public storage? Well, there's nothing wrong with them. They haven't done anything that's illegal, right? But you can't drive many miles down any major road in any part of the United States without seeing a public storage facility. And a lot of that's in there is people that have too much stuff that they can't keep at their own dwellings, which are at least 2 to 3 times the size that our parents and grandparents grew up in and that we grew up in. And so there's another social aspect is that we just have too much stuff. So there's a whole varieties, and I just begun to name some of the few of them with you that really concern me that things are going to become extremely, extremely tough. Crime is a growth industry in America. We can go on and on and on. And I don't think not only are the politicians not prepared for it, but the people who are supposed to have financial wherewithal and at least help people prepare for perhaps tougher times ahead have totally disregarded either on purpose or don't even have the recognition to understand it. And I guess the way to sum it up, Scott, is that if you wanted to get one sentence to describe it all, is I believe it's better to be a live chicken than a dead duck.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I was actually just watching an interview with Jimmy Carter, and he gave this famous speech on consumerism, how it was getting out of control. I mean, that was back in what, the 70s. And now it's kind of like that on crack with the Amazon crowd, right? It's just every day people are getting packages delivered to their house, and they've never lived through tough times. So, you have gone through tough times before. I know that. So do you think that's sort of lost on today's generation that they've never gone through these tough times and they just don't know how to prepare for it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't get a lot of Christmas cards from people in the financial service industry because one of the uh, problems I have with it is that for the most part, many of them were weaned on a one-way street. For the last few decades, other than some major hiccups for a very short period of time, it's been a one-way street. It was an artificially driven one-way street because the Federal Reserve decided to print tens of trillions of dollars that had to find some place. If you remember, and people lost sight of this, you have to go back to the last financial crisis in 2008 when we really cheated on something even potentially worse than the Depression of 1929. We bailed out the banks. We came up with all this money, and something called QE was created between Bernanke and Obama. And if you remember the original QE1, the money was mostly going to be spent on infrastructure. And we were going to rebuild America back then, and that would help the economy get better and better. However, the money went into Wall Street, but never made it really back to Main Street. And then there was QE2 and QE3, and it really created an artificial environment where risk taking and all sorts of other type of one-way investments proved worthy for those that could afford it, which was the upper scale. But that now is a card that's no longer available because we're not going to be able to print money in the way that we once did because of the things you and I just discussed. But people haven't accepted that and aren't prepared for that. And Scott, I still have a planning business, and I still, even though at one time it was a lot to do with wealthy athletes, uh, don't really be involved myself in that anymore because of what happens socially, politically to sports. But I can tell you that still about 7 out of 10 families, from working class all the way up to people making tens of millions, live at least one or sometimes two lifestyles above where their finances truly support. And everybody says, well, how do they do that? Well, they do it simply like we saw last month's economic numbers. We saw consumer spending up 7 tenths, and we saw personal income up 3 tenths. Well, where did they make up the difference? They borrow, and we borrow, we live off debt, and then of course we don't use our money that we do make for the things we're going to need in the future. Like I told you, 65% of the people are working paycheck to paycheck. Uh, Less than 1 out of 10 people are financially prepared for true retirement, as those commercials, lovely commercials, show you how you can live happily ever after. So again, I want to bring back to the fact that there's not a lot of good news for me. If I was involved with products or services that somehow benefit from that, it'd be great to say this, but a lot of people don't want to hear it. And the very fact that a lot of people discard it and don't even take it into consideration really concerns me and alarms me, especially you don't have to go too far to turn on the news and see all those things that we impacted, how the economy is hurting people, how we now see huge lines at food banks from the working class people needing to just to get by. And then, of course, all the social unrest that we see, particularly in the crime now, it's unfathomable. I can't imagine my parents and grandparents imagining that people could just walk into a place, take whatever they want, and the person who's it belongs to tries to stop them. They're the one in trouble, not the person that's taking it. That's how how crazy things have come, and unfortunately, there's going to be a price and a serious price to pay for that.
So I would say it kind of seems like the markets didn't get that memo. The markets seem to think that everything's fine. I mean, if you look at the price of the Dow today, I just going personal story, just going to the grocery store. I know a lot of people at the local grocery store near me, and most of them have 2 or 3 jobs now, which I think is actually being accounted for a lot of the gains in the labor statistics right now. But what do you see as the main catalyst? Let's just solely just think about markets right now. What is the main catalyst that would cause a crash in the markets?
Well, I don't believe there's going to be a crash, as negative as I am. Of course, if something terribly unforeseen happens, that's where the crash would occur. And the crash in '87 didn't have some of the safeguards that are in place now that would have tempered the decline and given people a chance to rationalize. And so I don't foresee a crash. You bring up 2 points. I want to answer the stock market, but I want to answer something else you brought up, which is all part of the real underlying truth that isn't being told. We have something called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, and each month their job is to put out an employment number. And for something like 13 or 14 months in a row, every number they put out has since been revised and revised lower. And it's just, there's no, any economic thinking cannot say that that could happen by accident for 14 months. And you're also right that when they do count, you could have 3 part-time jobs, but they would count that as 3 people being employed when it's really one person working 3 jobs in order to keep the head above water. So that's another statistic. But the thing about the stock market, understand this: the vast majority of people uh, have only seen a market that basically goes up. There's very few people that have been around going back to the '80s when we had a crash, or even before that. And so if you learn how to drive and you're just taught to drive on a one-way street, as long as that one-way street, there's no hiccups, no side tracks, no traffic circles, everything's fine. There's still enough liquidity out there. There's still enough money sloshing around. And this is what gets me cut off the Christmas list. Most of these people, let's just say somewhere between 51% and 99% on what I coined the don't worry, be happy crowd, is what I believe much in the financial service industry is made up of. You can toss them off the top of the Empire State Building. I'm telling you, all the way down, they'll all say the same thing. Hey, so far, so good. And they have yet to experience anything of depth or longer than a few weeks or a few months where it doesn't just go back up and keep going. And their assumption is it's going to do that again. All you have to do is look at all the forecasts now for 2024. They're all the same. And much of the financial industry journalists are tied to their hips. They are living off these folks and are not about to challenge them. They might as well, in my opinion, on some of the networks, go on there with pom poms and cheer the speaker on, because that's what it's like. But I don't think most people understand the undertones that I spoke about, how we're deteriorating from a debt level, how we're deteriorating as a society, how it's becoming overrun with more people wanting to get in a wagon, and those of us left to pull the wagon are being punished for pulling that wagon. We're not being supported or rewarded for taking the extra step. We're punishing to the point where we're either looking to get in the wagon or escape from where we have to pull the wagon. And these are all things that are now becoming acute. Now, it still may be a year or 2 or 4 years away. That does, like I said, but now that we know that these numbers that are real and growing exponentially are getting to a point where we just won't be able to operate no matter how optimistic you are, and it's only a few years away. I don't think we should wait until we get there to start prepare for it. There's an old saying: Noah didn't wait for it to rain to go ahead and start building the ark. It was sunny, I'm certain, when he started first building it, and I believe that's the same thing I need to do now, is build my ark before it gets rainy and have it all set and in place in order to be prepared for what I think will be much tougher times down the road.
And I want to ask you what that arc is in a moment, but I think a lot of people, your detractors, might say, well, these guys have been saying this for years. You look at some of these pundits like Jim Rickards, Harry Dent, Jeremy Grantham, Robert Kiyosaki, and they've been saying for years and years the crash is imminent, it's coming. Yet we always seem to get bailed out. They seem to keep kicking the can down the road. They pump money into the system. I mean, what's to stop that from them just keep doing that? I know you mentioned some things, but when does it end? How
Well,
far
I'm
can it
sure.
go?
Sure. I think the difference, and I'm not here to defend those guys because a lot of those guys have been one way themselves, and they happen to also sell things that benefit from that type of advice and all. But it was one thing when we were 10 or 20 trillion in debt. We're getting to levels now that have to be serviced. The interest has to be serviced. And we know statistically how much income we can possibly make. It's not like suddenly the United States could wake up and double and triple its personal income and therefore create enough discretionary income after paying for all these luxuries to pay down some, at least know we can service that interest. That's the first thing. And how do we know that we're actually getting to a point I call the fail-safe point, and that's from an old movie that we surpassed. We know it by what's happening around the world now. We see a movement that people laughed at, and still most on Wall Street are still laughing at it, and they're making a terrible mistake doing that. And that's what's called the BRIC nations. We're seeing a formation of countries, started out with a few, really gaining momentum now, and some key ones, including most importantly the Saudis, are now joining it. And call it what you want, but it's a group forming where the United States is going to be outside looking in. They want to move away from the United States in terms of using it as a reserve currency. They want to move away from it from being dominant as the uh, trading with them. And they really don't trust the United States, even some countries that you would consider semi-allies. And that's because of how we've handled ourselves on the world stage in recent times. And so that's a clear point. And they are selling our assets. They are some of the people that really carried us through those years, and maybe why the guys you mentioned ended up being wrong because these other places kept buying our debt, even kept it going higher. But now they're major sellers of it. Russia, China, others. They're liquidating aggressively U.S. assets. And so this all is playing into a mode. Now, like I said, it still could be 5 years away. The difference now is, in my view, is again, most people watching this are going to be around 5 or 10 years from now. And we cannot conceivably, in any way, shape, or form, continue on this road of incurring the debt and living the lifestyles we are without having something far worse than anything anybody's seen in their lifetime. And I think when people say to myself, well, how bad things are, well, I think this country is more divided now than any other time than possibly the Civil War. But I really do believe, and there's another thing that's important since we're on this. There's a coming age battle. We're seeing it now. We're seeing stories run where younger generations are saying, listen, I think these boomers have gotten away with it, and our problems are because how they lived. And where the big one is, why should we keep paying so much of our taxes towards Medicare and all? So these 85-year-old people can have a lung transplant or whatever they may be. And then the older person says, well, you took the money from me all these years and I want to live. We're seeing this come to the forefront now. And where those decisions will be made on who gets it and who doesn't is who's got the power. And as the boomer generation unfortunately passes, because that's a guarantee, that money is shifting to the younger generation. And wherever the money is, that's where the politicians will be. And so we're going to see a shift in the power structure in the United States away exclusively from the older generation and more to the younger generation. Again, there's too many flies in the ointment to think that the ointment is going to somehow turn into something delicious and we'll be okay. There's going to be a big price to pay. And the longer, in defense of those folks that you mentioned, the longer this trouble had to brew, the more difficult and longer it will be to get out of it. And people always ask me, in case you were prepared to ask it, well, how do you see us getting out of it? I don't see us getting out of it. I see a generation or more having to go through an enormously more difficult, challenging time than the one that I grew up in. And at a time when all things, particularly even within the world, how we'll be accepted and so forth, let alone if we can practice faith or anything of that nature. So, again, I wish I also had items that went along with this because those are the people that most like to hear this, but I don't. But I do think it'd be given all the blessings that have happened in my life, the battles that I've had in my own personal life, I believe I've been left here for what's ever remaining in my life, Scott, is to least people to hear this so they can't say, well, no one told me. I wasn't able to consider that. Well, I think you should at least consider some of the things that I spoke about today.
And that's kind of the beautiful thing of living in this modern age is that we could get voices out like yours out there, just to average person instead of having to go through news networks, right? Um, so you mentioned before earlier, you say you're talking about building an arc of safety to protect yourself, perhaps during an economic collapse. So what can the average person like myself do to protect ourselves for what's about to come or what you see is about to come, and perhaps even flourish in some ways? Is there any way that we could potentially benefit from that, like say some of the wealthier people do in the top 1%?
Well, I think less is more is the first thing to start with. I think we have to recognize that we don't need all the things. There's a wonderful skit that the old comedian George Carlin, who passed away several years ago, but he did called Too Much Stuff. And it really has realism for today's society. So that's the first. The second, and again, I have to put on my Christian faith back on my sleeve where I wear it all day. And that is in the book that I found most useful. I think it's the best financial book ever written. It's a book that's managed for a couple thousand years to influence more lives than anything else, the Bible. And whether you want to just look at it as an historical book or something more in terms of faith, there's not one positive verse about debt in it. And it has tremendous warnings about debt. And again, I think getting out of debt, lowering debt, is very, very important. There isn't a person I met ever yet that got out of debt and said to me, gee, I made a mistake. I really wish I was heavily back in debt. I enjoyed life more. No, it's not the case. So those are the first two things. Less is more, getting out of debt. Recognize that governments are only going to have two choices, Scott. They're either going to be able to raise taxes and or cut services. So where you also live is going to be infected. Big cities are already seeing that now. Let's take a case in point, New York City now. It's seen a great exodus of very wealthy people. A, because taxation has become far too high. There's other states where they can make a lot more to their bottom line. B, safety concerns, lifestyle, all those type of things. So where you're also going to live, and let's not forget that certain states and cities chose to go a certain route, and now suddenly they realize that that route might have not been the best choice. But the problem is they're losing an economic base that can support. So those that remain are going to be heavily taxed and see far less service, and it'll just create a snowball effect of more and more people getting out. So there's already a big change. We've already seen lots of people leaving states like California and heading to Texas and Florida, even up to Montana and North Dakotas and so forth. So I think there's, before you even start thinking about what you should invest in, I think there's other actions to take before that. After that, there's always the old saying that adversity creates opportunity. But I think those opportunities are going to be far less. And I don't think there's enough financial advisors out there prudent enough uh, to see this and prepare for it in an appropriate way. And so I believe what will happen is most people will find themselves overinvested. When it becomes apparent, they're all going to try, or a lot of them to try to get to a small exit door. And that's when the opportunity of crashes or negative thoughts that you might have had earlier can play out. But I don't think we're close to that yet.
So when does that not crashes, but do we start seeing the markets declining? If you could just put any sort of estimation, I know this isn't a winning game trying to predict this, but do you have any sort of estimate? Would it be in 2024, 2025?
Well, those of us who looked at a crystal ball for a livelihood, the only thing we ended up with, Scott, over time was learned how to eat a lot of broken glass. So I don't like to predict that. And also, Jimmy Dines had one of the greatest sayings. He says, think of the poor guy that invented preparation G, because timing is everything. I'm not too worried about what year it is. If you think you're only going to live another year or two, I wouldn't worry as much. If you think your life is going to have at least 5 to 10 years in it, then I think the things that we talked about are really concerning. For instance, as we speak today here, I talked about a product that for years I would have never touched when I was a licensed financial advisor, but it's finally become useful enough, especially for those that can't afford loss of principal. And I think protecting principal, it's not how much you're going to make that's going to separate you from the winners and losers over the coming years. It's how much you don't lose. And I think that's going to be the key. And that's why I think safety of principal. Remember, almost all investments have some speculative part of them. And the word speculating was created so we don't call it what it really is, and that's gambling. And when you gamble slash speculate, you have to be prepared both mentally and financially to lose part of all your investments. And most people aren't, but they've grown accustomed to a lifestyle that they think will continually be supported by these investments that they were making. The latest craze being cryptocurrencies, even though for a large scale of people, over $1 trillion was lost in so many coins and things that were came out and disappeared. Now we're through that phase two now of that's the most hyped product I've ever seen in my career. Doesn't mean some of it won't last or make it, but it is beyond reason to hear people give predictions it's going to be 1 million or 2 million. And let's get first to 40,000 before we start talking about 1 million. But that's what happens in hyped scenarios. And one other negative plug about that is a well-known gentleman that runs BlackRock, who just a few years ago basically said it was criminal as an investment. Now he loves it. Why? His firm happens to be coming out, hopefully to bring out an exchange traded fund where they can make hundreds of millions of dollars from it. So be careful why someone is giving particular advice. What's in it for me? We all have something in it for me. I'm not doing this 100% for the love of God. I mean, hopefully it's a large percentage, but everybody has a reason. And I'll just tell you that I just don't see the financial service industry grasping the ramifications. And they themselves live a lifestyle that's quite high, and they need to continue for people to keep believing in the bull market and put aside these concerns we spoke about in order to keep making money on your money so they can live their lifestyle.
So let's get down to business. Let's talk about the nitty gritty here, and what everybody wants to know. Okay, what would Peter Grandich recommend buying as an investment right now? Obviously, you mentioned cutting down the debt, not consuming as much as we are, but is there any safe place that we could go? What might look like a good investment to you right now?
Well, I don't give investment advice. I share my observations and what I may be doing. And I never liked doing this even when I was licensed because it's a cookie cutter approach. And what's good for me could be absolutely detrimental to someone listening to this. And so I don't like to talk in that regard. I do think that if one has risk tolerance of a high degree, there's always some segment of markets that have been overdone for one reason or another, and they can be hoped somewhat that they will turn around. And in that area, uh, right now the world has made a big bet on this electrification. Even though I think there's several hiccups coming along the way, but the governments have committed completely to it. So that's why, by hook or by crook, they're going to get there. They may not get to the level or in the timing that they thought, but they're going to not stop at this point in time. And the problem with that is there's not enough metals known that available in order to support that movement to electrification. So certain metals like copper and others uh, are going to be a need for at a time when, for a lot of years, companies have not spent the money necessary to find these type of metals. And even if you find them, it doesn't happen overnight. You don't find it, bring it up and all. So one of the areas that I personally, for myself, am focusing on is metals and the companies that look for them. And but their loss of capital is very usual. In fact, for the high risk ones, the companies that are just exploring or what we like to call junior resource, 8 out of 10 will never develop a mine. They all may have good intentions. So if you just buy them and hold them, or buy them with money you can ill afford to lose, you're making a horrific mistake. If you can speculate and take the risk that comes with it, now's the time, because they had a horrific year. In fact, first time in my 40-year career, I personally, for my own investments, was on the wrong side of a bear market. And it's been a vicious bear market. But as I just noted in something I put out today before speaking with you, is what was as bad as it was for 2023 appears to be given an opportunity in 2024. But again, those are things that you shouldn't react just because you heard somebody speaking about it and it sounds like they know what they were talking about. You need to truly make sure that they fit into your personal objectives. And if you don't know enough, you have to have enough trust in someone who's proven to you past a few days or a few weeks that they know what the heck they're talking about.
So in some of your interviews, you've been talking about how you think gold, there's such a huge difference between the gold price and a lot of miners, especially junior miners, which have been absolutely crushed. Can you explain? So first off, do you think that that would be maybe a good place for some people who are a little bit more risk tolerant to allocate some of their cash? And why do you think there's such a discrepancy between the gold price and these miners?
Again, I addressed that in a report I just put out this morning. The gold price did fairly well. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, it was 1650, and as you and I speak, it's over 2000. That's not a bad return in less than 2 years. I do think it'll eventually be higher by at least a few $100 higher. And that means there's a lot of profitability for companies, because total cost usually to develop and bring an ounce of gold to where it'll make hundreds of dollars profit on each ounce. With that said, the industry itself, especially the high risk pure exploration companies, they've run into a lot of challenges that didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. First of all, they no longer have the individual advisor who used to build a book of business around her or his clientele, who many of which would buy these stocks if they recommended it to them, because commission-driven business is basically non-existent now. And so the junior company who used to be able to find one financial advisor who would turn into 100 or 300 shareholders now still has to hope to find those 100 to 300 shareholders, but in a different medium and more on a one-to-one basis. That's, I think, is the single biggest change in that industry. The second is the regulatory. It's been very hard, even if you want to still do that, to practice that. And then, of course, competition. Things we spoke about earlier, things like cryptocurrencies came along, and they took away some of the money that used to flow into this industry. And unfortunately, some of that money went to money heaven in the cryptocurrency. So it's not like it can switch back. So it's still very challenging, but they've been so beaten down, as you said, it's not going to take much to suddenly see, 100 or 200% return, even though that still may not get back those companies to where they came down from. But for anybody that's buying them now, they would be great. They would be great, returns.
So we can't leave this interview without maybe trying to get a few picks out of you. I know that you and I share one that we're pretty interested in called Arizona Metals, which is a gold and copper play. Is that something that you're still pretty confident in your investment? And I will throw the caveat in there that this is not investment advice, and I know that this isn't for everyone. But can you speak of that at least a little bit?
Well, it is my personal largest holding by far. It's the largest holding I've ever had. And it's the largest holding of the only person I've really, after decades, can say that I would trust with my own life, let alone my finances, who also happens to be the largest single shareholder of that company. And although the company has been disappointed in some sense on some fronts, the most important fronts of finding uh, large scale metal continues to happen by them. And that's why where the share price now is, it doesn't reflect, to my mind, what it really could be worth. But again, people have to be prepared mentally and financially to lose part or all their investment if they're going to own a stock like that. But buying at the levels that it is now, uh, it's inconceivable for me to find a reason why it can't go back to its high that it had if it continues having success on the drilling side, even if that market itself doesn't get better as my report is optimistic it will be. But again, you have to be prepared financially and mentally. And I think that's an important thing to intertwine here, Scott. Not only do you have to be financially afford, but I've watched people lose and their whole mental life changes. And that doesn't, it's not worth taking chances if that's going to occur. That your whole day to day lifestyle changes because simply you're too worried or too upset. And so that's when I say to people, you have to be both financially and mentally prepared. And some are financially, but very few really realize what it is to lose money and what it feels like until it happens. And then they wish they never did it to begin with.
100% agree. So what is it that you like so much about Arizona Metals? Can you break it down a little bit more for us?
Well, I think where people were going to look in the world, this was an industry at one time where it was the major part of my daily livelihood. And in those 20 or 25 years, back then you could have took a globe, we could have spun it, put our finger anywhere and say, yeah, we can go there to that country. Not anymore. We're witnessing all sorts of changes. We're witnessing a company that may end up losing $1 billion or more project in Panama because the country's basically said it's our way now or the highway. So where a company looks for these metals is paramount now, and it wasn't as big a concern 10, 20, or 30 years ago. What kind of metal is probably important in this company's particular case? Gold, copper, and zinc are all bullishly fundamentally outlook for the metal themselves. That's another reason for it. And in this particular case, the grades are so high on what they've already discovered and what we're optimistic they'll continue to discover that it's going to be a very profitable mine for someone to run. My personal opinion is that this company will be sold or taken over long before the first ounce is poured. Uh, and In fact, one of the I wouldn't call it a negative, but one of the back of the mind concerns I have now is because the stock has been driven down so low, and I think some people are a little bit peed off. I'm one of them. That the management has now uh, pushed out further when they expect to bring in an initial resource. Also, when they're going to be drilling again in a major way is now many months away versus a few months away. I think someone can step up here now and offer a double or even a triple from the current price, which would be great if you first bought here. But for many of us, that would be just back to where we first bought it. I think they're very vulnerable to that. And they're not alone. The major mining companies have spent a decade or more de emphasizing capital expenditures looking for new metals. And because of that and other smart moves they make, they're in the best financial shape I've ever seen them in my 40 years. They have extremely positive free cash flow. And so I expect a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And this company is got to be a target. Now, normally companies don't make a bid for a company until at least has initial resource. But there's so much back of the envelope type of stuff that you could figure out here and start putting valuations on this company now that paying twice the price here would still be paying a very cheap price. And some major may decide to do that. And I think it'll be very hard for the company to defend that because a lot of people who are down would like that liquidity because there's a lot of other things they can buy that are still down.
I sort of like to end things on a more of a personal note. And you're a man of great wisdom. You've learned a lot through your career and your life. I think, as I've heard you speak about a lot of interviews, you've had lots of ups and downs in your life. Um, if you could offer some advice to younger people, I guess looking to improve their lives, both, I guess, sort of financially and just and other endeavors in their lives, what would you recommend to them? What sort of general advice can you give on that end?
So, whether or not they're spiritual, for those of us that are Christian, we depend a lot on a book that was given to us for our foundation and really I call the manual of life, the Bible. And one of the great sayings in it is you can't serve both man and money. And it's true. I thought I could in my first half of my career, but I really gave lip service to the God part and spent more time focused on the money part. And because of that, I made and lost. And with that, uh, I suffered severe depressional bouts. It's something that a lot of people don't talk about on Wall Street but go through. There's a lot of addiction on Wall Street among financial advisors that don't get spoken about. And I just think that money is not the answer to everything. And it's hard to hear that when you're younger because it seems it gets you things that appears other people are happy. But I'll tell you this much. I truly have discovered that more people with less, on average, have more real happiness than some of the wealthiest people. I dealt with them. I dealt with athletes that made tens of millions of dollars a year. I had a couple clients when I was an active money manager. One, two was in the Forbes 400. And the world, especially Wall Street and Madison Avenue, would want you to believe that more money equals more happiness. You just have to watch their financial commercials. That's what they're all about. They show you, come to us, we reach your goals, and then you're doing all the things you want golf, sailing, whatever they show the pictures of the thing. But they would want you to think that always the guy that owns the bus company is always happier than the guy driving a bus for him. And yet, some of the happiest people, really truly content people, not even involved spirituality, just true day to day happiness, were people with little or no means. And so, the single best advice I would say is don't get caught up on the money chase. You'll never make enough to get satisfaction. It's like playing golf. You break 100. Wow, this is great. If I can only get to 90, some get to 90. Man, if I could just get to 80, then I get to 80. If I can improve my game, I could be on the tour. And then you get on the tour and you realize, even though you're on the tour, you're still one of the worst on the tour. So you're always chasing an apple that just is always just out of reach. And I just think if we learn to live with less is more and find the reason for wanting to get up other than to go make money. For me, that has been faith. I never try to sell my faith to everybody, but I can tell you this, even if it's not true, someone said to me the other day, well, Pete, what happens if all what you believe isn't real? My response is always the same. It's still a better way to live. And that's the best advice I think I can give.
So, just to summarize that a little bit, would you say that instead of chasing the wealth, you should chase more value and purpose that you could bring to the world? And that's what's going to bring about the most wealth in your life.
Yeah, starting with yourself. Not that we're called, again, as Christians, we're called to love our God with all our heart and all our mind, and then love others the way we want to be loved. And we were told those are by far the two most important things. But I think if you don't love yourself, if you're not content with yourself, it's very, very hard to do good things for other people. And we compare ourselves to what's being shown in social media now. It used to be television for my generation, now social media. And these are fictitious. These people, celebrities and all this type of stuff. And we younger people are demeaning themselves or feeling that's why there's so much more problems with youth today because they much higher pedestals they're trying to place themselves on in order to appear like others that are supposedly having all the fun and all, when in reality, that's not the case. So I just think you need to first work on yourself, be content with yourself, and then recognize that there are blessings every morning. It doesn't take much to go see what some people are going through to see really what gifts you really have, and then build on that.
Now, I want to ask you one final question, Peter. Actually, two final questions, if you don't mind. But you said I could ask anything. And a
Yeah.
lot of people don't like being asked this question. So you could skip over it if you want to. We're entering into an election year. This might be, in my estimation, maybe the craziest year to come in my lifetime. I can't even imagine what's going to happen in 2024. We got two presidents. One's being indicted for more crimes than I could imagine. We have an independent candidate who's running pretty high. Yeah, Joe Biden's losing his mind. We don't know who's going to be actually running in a year from now. Do you have any leanings on your political beliefs? Do you have any hopefuls for 2024?
Well, I think you made a very good point, and it's part of my consideration. It's a year away, a little less than a year now. And it is possible that supposedly two leading candidates right now may not be the candidates for the reasons that you spoke about. One may, or both may not be. I think this issue is bigger than any one person. I can say this much. I do believe in the last 3 years, more damage has been done to America than in any other 3 year period beforehand. Uh, to me, I think we would be in much more difficulty, as bad as things are, if the person or really the people who are prompting the current person up get another 4 years. That's not to say that another potential Democrat could not do better, but I do think this has been an historically poor administration. You don't have to look far. You just have to go down to what's happening with our borders. And let me tell you why I say that. It's not because I'm prejudicial, but when you have 7 to 10 million people coming with their shirts on their back, you have to understand that for these people, even as bad as some of us would think what they're ending up with here, it's still a whole lot better than where they left. And therefore, they're only going to encourage other people I know that they know that are back there to come here. So we're not going to solve this issue by, well, ship them from New York to, put them on a plane to here or this to that, because it's going to keep coming whether there's a border or not. Whether or not tomorrow we enforced all the things that the previous administration, there's still going to be a lot more people coming until that time that they realize that they can't get in the way that the others did and so forth. And that issue really compounds things because all those people, remember, are coming with the shirts on their back. We're not even talking about potentially who could be here for bad reasons and all that. And we're at a point in time where in the United States, we're having trouble taking care of people that are already here. And the worst was that we just saw in recent times is what happens to our vets, veterans, people who fought, lost arms, legs, way of life. They're treated worse than the people that are being let in. And I think that's the real bad news in what has happened here. So for me, I don't want to see this administration that's currently in win again just for that reason alone. And I think there's other reasons. The other issue is, as good as it may feel that someone spoke up in a better way, the previous president, and things were somewhat better, is it so much against what he has going for him that people who will still remain in charge of other places will be so detrimental that as one person he can't overcome that? I think that's part of the issue and so forth. They certainly have done everything they can to stop him. And so my view is if they can't stop him, will they try to hurt him? And that's something that I think could be really detrimental to the United States and all. And I just think the whole political system is broken. And like I said to you earlier in this conversation, when you have people within their own parties now fighting worse than ever that two different parties used to fight, how are we conceivably going to do anything? Let me tell you this, talk to any small business owner, which makes up a good part of our planning clientele, and they'll tell you it's never, ever been anywhere close to try to run a business in America now than it is right now. There's not only did COVID screw everything up in so many different ways, but there hasn't been good federal legislation to help the small business owner in years, going back long before COVID, but especially in the last few years, when they're the backbone of America. It's not big business, it's the small business owner. And they are just throwing their hands up. Hard to get people to work, cost, everything. And so, whoever may take over, they have a lot of big issues to take over. But some of them, we have to start with stopping this excess of people coming in, going back to helping what's the backbone of America, small business. And that's perhaps why Trump does get a theme, because that is, in a sense, put America first. But who doesn't? I don't think people in France go, well, let's help America first. I don't think people in Singapore go, let's help America first. No, you focus on your own family to get it in order so then you can help others. And so answering your question is, I don't know if there's any one person that's the answer, but I do think there's a couple that are clearly not the answer. And the clear one is the person that's currently there now.
Peter Grandich, I just want to thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
I know we went a little bit over time today. Thank you for your patience, and I really hope to maybe see you back on again sometime, and maybe things will be a little bit better when you do come back on. So thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share, and have a most blessed day.
You too. Thank you.